Good day, everyone, all the participants of our today's first this year meeting, the event of the educational platform of Pitch UA. I do hope that there will be more people joining us during the event, during our conversation. My name is Alexander Kleimanov, and I am the director of the TV and cinema content in the project of TCA. This is the project on the USAID. We are the organization of the grant competition of Pitch UA. That's a competition, a contest which is supporting the producers of the socially important and significant content, the content of social importance. The producers could be any producers if they are working in Ukraine. And also we are conducting such meetings which we name educational platforms. At these meetings we involve foreign experts who are telling us about various aspects of content production. And today we are starting a series of 3 meetings. The first one is today, the second will be held on Monday, and the third will be done next Friday. So we have devoted those meetings to the issues of the Ukrainian content entering the international market during the war. So all of us, in fact, who are the producers of content faced that we need to take Ukrainian content beyond the country, and rather frequently we need to do it urgently, but not everybody knows how it should be done properly. In the same way, we have the decrease of the number of sources of funding for the content production in Ukraine. That is why lots of producers started to urgently search for the opportunity to find this funding abroad, to find partners on co-production, to find partners for co-funding of the content. And again, rather often we have some of the issues and questions, where to search for them, how to approach them, how to position your offer properly, and which mistakes we need to prevent or avoid. It's interesting how it was done by our colleagues. It's interesting to get to know about it in advance, not to repeat their mistakes, and to use the best practices. So, today, we have the first meeting of this series, which we named Ukrainian Content Overcomes the Borders, how it can be done best in the best way possible. The first meeting is an introductory part to the series of 3 meetings. Today we will be speaking about, well, maybe for some of you rather basic things, but still don't be hasty. If you think that you know everything, you will still have an opportunity to pose some of the questions and hear the answers of our today's hosts and guests. Those are our permanent and constant experts of the grant competition Pitch UA, Adam Sigel and Josh Weinstock. They're joining us today directly from Los Angeles, so from Hollywood, I would say, in fact, and we are so grateful for that. It is so early there because it's early morning now there, right? So I will now give the floor to Adam and Josh. So again, I'd like to say that our guests, our experts, have multi-year experience of production of content in the United States. Both of them are producers, both of them are permanent participants of the contests of Pitch UA in Ukraine. They know the Ukrainian market really well, they know the peculiarities of the Ukrainian market, and they conduct consultations with the teams who got grant support as the outcome of Pitch UA competitions. I guess that's it from me in my introduction speech, so please write your questions here in the chat in Zoom for those participants who joined us in Zoom. And those who are watching us in YouTube, you can leave your questions there. We will note them down and then we'll pose them for our experts. So finally, the ones who are taking part in the Zoom broadcast will be able to ask their questions directly with the use of the camera after the end of the presentation by Adam and Josh. And I'm giving the floor to you.
Handing this over to you, please say a couple of words about who you are in case our guests today did not follow any of our previous activities. So off we go. Thank you very much for doing this for us today.
Thanks, Alex.
Thanks, Alex. Hello. Hi, everyone. My name's Adam Sigel, and also over here is Josh.
Ooh.
And I'll just introduce myself. I'm a writer and producer. I've been working in Ukraine now for it's 5 years, actually coming up to there. So I've become very well acquainted with a number of producers, with creatives and teams. Since the invasion of last February, it's obviously changed a lot. And I'm still very active in developing and producing shows by Ukrainians for Ukrainians. But really, as Alex has said, the situation has changed very dramatically, wherein there is a much needed perspective for the international market and understanding the international market. Josh, you introduce yourself.
Yeah, hey, I'm Josh Weinstock. I have been producing film and television for close to 20 years. First 10 years, I worked for big companies like Warner Brothers and New Line and Disney, and then I struck out on my own as a producer and been producing feature films, both on the studio side and independent side for companies like Netflix and HBO and Warner Brothers. And anyways, I've been working with the program in Ukraine for about 3 years. Had the pleasure of developing a lot of projects and overseeing a lot of great content coming out of Ukraine with local filmmakers. And as Adam said, obviously the landscape has changed a lot in the last year. And hopefully this discussion will help, encourage you guys to sort of think outside the box as resources have become somewhat limited over the last year. And I also wanted to say to Adam, happy St. Patrick's Day. I see you're wearing the green, which I am not. So I'm probably going to get punched all day. But anyways, I think that sort of sets up a good entry point into, international co-productions. So
and let me just jump in for 1 second. I forgot to mention about the availability of simultaneous translation on this stream, but I'm sure people figured it out. Шановні учасники, якщо ви ще не знайшли...
Dear participants, if you still haven't found, we have simultaneous interpretation provided here. If you haven't set it up, the Ukrainian channel, you can just find in Zoom the icon at the bottom panel. There is the globe icon, and there you can select the Ukrainian interpretation. If you don't understand or it's hard for you to understand English, and those who are watching us in YouTube, we have 2 simultaneous broadcasts. One of them is with Ukrainian interpretation, the other is in English.
Adam and Josh?
All right.
Over to you.
Okay, so to start with, what we want to say is a lot of the material we're about to go through, we're going to kind of try to get to it very quickly. It's very basic. Pretty much, I'm not saying anything new here from an international production point of view. So some of you may know a bunch of this stuff. We just wanted to make sure, we wanted to give what we're calling a primer, just getting you ready for what will be very new and very interesting conversations we have next week. We're going to be having on Monday at the same time, we're going to be having two production teams, Ukrainian producers who are currently making co-productions. They also have experience in selling their projects as acquisitions. So they both are, and they're currently, like I said, working on two different projects that are co-financed with regional broadcasters. And then on Friday next week, we're going to be talking to a company out of Norway, NRK, which is the national broadcaster, who is now currently co-producing actually some of these projects, as well as others, and have been very active and interested in co-producing and acquiring Ukrainian projects. So Monday, same time, we'll have the producers who have had to sell their projects as co-productions or as acquisitions. And then on Friday, we'll have the conversation with the buyers, two executives from NRK. And we will, that will be just much more about how this works, right? It's the proof of it. Today, we're just making sure everyone understands the language, what we're talking about, some very basic ideas. All right, but to start, let me pull this up here. Okay. All right. Can everyone see this? Okay, good. All right, so basically we're talking about international productions in very broad terms, right? And again, very basic. There's two real types of sort of financing opportunities here. One is a co-production, which is a joint venture between two or more companies that share the costs. And then, of course, there's acquisitions. Now, this is the purchase of content by distributors, channels, streamers, etc. After in general terms, after the completion of the project, and sometimes after it's initially shown, right, after it's initially released. Co-productions, just in a very general term, it's your partner. It's finding partners. It's finding companies in other countries who are and would be interested and are invested in the concept that you're creating, and you forge a relationship and you work together on it.
Yeah. So again, very basic, but what are they? So typically it'll involve two or three companies from different countries. So those are like production entities, buyers. So essentially, for instance, company from Ukraine will partner up with a company from, Poland or France, and together, they'll work together in terms of sharing costs and resources and accessing different funds. Typically, each country will have its sort of national funding body, meaning that you can get incentives, tax rebates, grant money, essentially, right, from the countries themselves. And really, the whole reason behind this is because each country is really sort of seeking to achieve economic, cultural, and diplomatic goals. Like, it's just another opportunity to sort of put their country in the spotlight on screen for different audiences.
Yeah, and from the co-production point of view, it's really about those. I mean, these are sort of the opportunities, right, in terms of the economic and cultural values. And this gets us to the benefits, which is it opens new markets. So you're now, you're doing a co-production with Poland. So now Polish viewers will be able to watch your projects. The Polish producer will have Ukrainian viewers. So that's obviously increasing the audience. Obviously, this is about pooling resources, right? Which is specifically important with smaller countries. So this now, and what it does is it opens up pathways when you make these co-productions to access the incentives and the subsidies that are offered in different countries. We'll get into that in more detail in a second. But basically, the name of the game here is being able to create, more expensive, high quality productions that will compete with the sort of, higher productions and, a higher cost that other countries can afford. So, for example, a country like Germany, which is 90 million people, which is quite wealthy, they can produce very high quality shows pretty much on their own. But smaller countries in the Baltics or in Scandinavia or even different parts of Europe who have smaller populations and the smaller sort of industries, this is a way for them to now pull their resources and compete in terms of the quality style of the show.
So how do they work? So typically, and this is primarily in Europe, unfortunately, the United States does not have any treaties with any of the countries when it comes to production. But these are often referred to as official co-productions. So basically, each country will have a treaty with another country that basically allows the access and benefits to the funding. And within these treaties, often there are these requirements, typically related to creative content, local spends, nationality of town and crew, meaning that, and we're going to talk a little bit about it in a second, but there's a thing called a point system that each country will have in order to sort of check off to ultimately fulfill what those requirements will be. And each country will have some overlapping, but they're also individual. So just because the checklist in Germany might not equal exactly what the checklist will be in Italy. So it's going to be really important to sort of cross-check and make sure that you're abiding by those different requirements.
Yeah. So, and speaking of requirements, so and this is the idea. This is this cultural test. The reason that these funds exist is they're basically looking to support and build the domestic creative and technical companies and people within their country. So as Josh just said, there's this point system, and it's very detailed. It's very, very specific. All of this is available online. So, but essentially, it's around the nationality of the key positions, the cast, the producers, the directors, the writers, as well as the locations where post-production. Each country will have specific requirements, and you have to meet a threshold in order to of key people in those countries in order to get access to the funding. Josh alluded to this earlier. Just occurred to me. The funding is not always it's not cash necessarily or money directly. Sometimes it is, but sometimes it's in cash rebates. We'll get into that in a minute. But cash rebates are thus being sort of almost tax benefits or cash rebates that will come after the fact or get repaid after the project. The important thing here, and if you've been with us at Pitch UA for the last 4.5 years since we've been doing it, a lot of these funds are very similar to what Pitch UA is asking for. They're looking for social impact content. So a lot of the same, in fact, very much the model when we started working on this originally, Pitch UA is very much modeled after these types of international funding bodies. So they're looking for social impact content. And that's something, that, obviously you've got to kind of have your head around a little bit when you're looking, particularly at some of these cultural funds. And then finally, when applying or when trying to find co-producers or when trying to, access the funding in these different countries, it is often required that you have some funding already. So it could be, maybe 15, 20, 25%. Essentially, it's this, once people know that somebody likes you, somebody's interested in financing you, they're willing to put in money in themselves. So it's important to remember, it's not just good enough to go in there and say, hey, I have these projects. It is really important to try to get some core financing to start with. That makes the conversation much easier when dealing with partners.
So what are these, what are the fund's objectives? And as, Adam just sort of talked about, it's really sort of to help promote. So oftentimes each country will have their own cultural funds, or the region. There's a ton of funds out there, but, for instance, some of the main big ones are like Creative Europe, BFI, Nordis, CMF, which is Canada, Screen Australia, and again, their objectives is to actively seek projects that basically safeguard, develop, promote designated culture, linguistics, diversity, and heritage. So it's to sort of help prop up projects, that sort of cover the umbrella of promoting the country, promoting sort of the underlying language, the underlying history, the underlying storytelling, and really giving these projects that sometimes can't compete against some of the bigger projects, like an increased competitiveness and economic potential of the culture and creative sectors. So again, like, a lot of these funds are seeking social issue content that, tends to be smaller and tends to be a little bit more niche, but by tapping into these financing benefits, it'll help sort of prop up these projects that otherwise would be having a harder time competing with others.
Yeah. So, and to be clear, right? Like, there are co-productions that you can make on projects that don't involve these funds, right? You can just find financiers, you can find partners who do this. But what these funds, and this has been true in Ukraine, this has been true, pretty much all over except for the US, is that these funds exist to primarily. Sorry, I'm hearing someone on the call.
Перепрошую, можуть всі учасники зам'ютити свої мікрофони, будь ласка, бо ми чуємо чиїсь телефонні розмови. Дякую. Sorry, Adam.
No worries. So basically, look, there are, private companies in all these countries, they're making content, they're doing, and they're doing it without this funding. And they tend to be, obviously the shows that are the obvious, go-tos, maybe sometimes certain genres, horror movies or that sort of stuff. What these cultural bodies are basically doing, as many of you know, again, this is very basic, they're just trying to make these other projects more competitive, right? They're trying to give subjects and ideas that won't necessarily have the funding an ability to compete, so they can actually get made, and we can get better quality content. That's really sort of it. So it's a specific thing. It's not everyone's project. So if you have a project that is a horror movie or is something that's much more mainstream, right, as we say, then maybe you work outside these funding bodies. So this is very specific to these cultural funds. Important to understand. So you got to understand the rules, right? When trying to access these funding bodies, and if any of you producers have worked with USAID, we've got rules, right? USAID has a lot of rules. There's a lot of regulations, but you've got to approach this strategically. Okay, and the key here is to avoid any disruption in your funding. Okay, and what that means is creating a production plan. So make sure that you're not going to be losing points, which could then take you under the threshold, and that could then cost you your rebate or cost you some of these funding. So in general terms, these incentives are usually rewarded at the end of the production. And often, I mean, the scenario can be you find a finance partner who will actually pay for it all up front. But they know that after production, they will get 40 or 50 or some percentage back from these funding bodies. So that tends to be the case. But but it's just important to know that these funding bodies don't necessarily hand you the money, right? You're going to have to find other ways of sort of getting it. There are mechanisms in place where you can get people to forward you the money, but then you have to give a portion of it back to them when, so you're not getting all of it, right? So it's far more complicated than we're going to describe here, but generally because each case is different. But just know that A, they don't always and often don't get funded up front, and B, they can take it back. So even if they do give you the money up front, if you haven't met the obligation, then it's going to get taken back. So it's really important to understand all the aspects of the production spend, right? It's what they call. So it's like making sure it's got to be about these people and this personnel. So and for the most part, again, generally speaking, or I should say, sometimes it's only the below the line costs, which is the baseline of your production and of your project. In some cases, they do include above the line people, and obviously, just to be really clear, above the line, sort of stars or names, actors, directors, obviously people that are more known internationally. So know that generally these apply to the below the line costs, because often the below the line costs are the local hires. So that's usually what it is. But it's the key thing is to note, and again, it's why you have a production plan, to note which people, where the points are, who you have to have in this position. So all of that is really, really crucial. And note, and in general terms, not all these people actually may live in their country anymore. So, for example, you could have a director who's Polish for a Polish, funded project, but that director might be living somewhere else. As long as they have a passport, right? As long as they are a national of that country, then it's fine. But again, all of these things have to be built into the plan ahead of time, so you're not, you're not messing it up later on.
Yeah, and
all right.
And just real quick to add to that, there are some developing countries that Adam, as you said, like that do include the above line costs into their incentives. So, if you're looking to sort of explore that, countries like Malta, for instance, will give up to 40% on everything. So that I as a U.S. producer, I could produce piece of content in Malta with American actors, American producers, American director, and I will get money back from that country. So
yeah, and what we're doing here obviously is very basic. There's a lot more complicated. Some of these funds have maximum amounts per year, so they award certain projects. It means first come, first serve. You have to get in there. There are a whole bunch of other issues and aspects of it. But this just gives you a general idea so that when we talk about it, above the line, below the line, you understand these references. Okay. International acquisitions.
So this is the fun part where you get money for your hard work.
Right. Now, and when we're separating the two, right, there is sometimes an overlap between these two, and we'll get into that in a second. But just so you know, right, the co-production tends to be very early on, development stage. Acquisitions comes much later. When do you start, Josh?
Right. Yeah. So what are they? So it's typically series, so that's television, digital, or films. Basically, are purchased after the project is completed, as Adam just sort of talked about. And typically, it's pretty rare that a company will just buy out something outright, basically forever. So often we refer to this as a license fee. So essentially, you have a piece of content, buyer will negotiate the rights for a specific territory. So, each country, each region could have its own sort of individual buyer. And basically, the idea is that in exchange for your piece of content, they give you money. In exchange, they have sort of the rights to air your content and to show it. And again, typically it's isolated to that specific country. So you have the ability to, reach out and negotiate with multiple buyers. Obviously, every once in a while, you have sort of the big international streamers like the Netflix, the Disney Pluses, the Amazon Primes, the Apples. They'll sometimes come in and purchase the rights for the entire world. So we typically call that worldwide acquisition rights.
Right.
And essentially, you are assigning the rights of your content over to them, and in exchange, they're going to air it pretty much everywhere. Or if they have specific regions, they might air it in that specific region, and then and then turn around and also then license to a regional broadcaster. So there's a lot of sort of revenue streams that can be pursued. And as we just mentioned, like typically these licenses are for a limited period of time. So they don't have it forever. Eventually you will get the rights back unless they want to renegotiate for another period of time. And these periods of times all boil down to whatever you negotiate. Sometimes it could be a year, sometimes it could be 5 years, sometimes it could be 20 plus years. So it really just depends on what sort of the objectives are.
And it's important to keep in mind, the big international streamers are not doing a lot of original, or and you might argue not doing any original content, proper like co-productions with Ukraine or with a lot of a number of countries, right? They only acquire. Right now, Netflix is really only acquiring Ukrainian content, and so it is a very important piece of this. And in many regards, it's actually where often the profit from any project will be produced, right? So this is sort of the benefit. It adds to the revenue of your project. So you do one idea here would be you do a co-production and you have an independent investor who's come in. They will finance it. You get these sort of rebates that you get some of the money back. You're able to sort of finance it all the way, just your core production and what the costs are. But then it's the acquisition side. That's where the money is really earned for profit. And that's where your finance partner will make their money. So it really is a crucial part of the whole international production scene. This obviously provides a greater exposure for the material. You can build obviously your reputation as a producer, and a number of the people we're meeting next week, for example, they now have much greater reputation and awareness internationally. And this is really important for Ukraine right now. It's also about building the reputation of your country and showcasing your country. So this is incredibly important right now for Ukraine. Distributors can, from their point of view, it's a lower risk, right? They can actually see what they're going to get. So from their point of view, they can actually understand, okay, this will work for my audience. This makes sense. And then they just pay the money, but they don't, because they didn't co-produce, they don't necessarily participate in reselling it, right? They're just buying it, and then they're done. So lower upside on their part, but they have lower risk. And then obviously, if a show gets a lot of acquisition attention and gets sold in lots of different territories, then that will often lead to the original finance team or whoever put it together to want to then do additional seasons. So acquisitions are, as I say, it's so critical right now for Ukraine to be thinking about this, because this is how you're going to have multiple seasons of a show. Once people are buying it internationally, that will open up the door for you to actually, make the show live or last longer.
Yeah. So often, how do they work? So, and I think this is sort of, a question that we get a lot is like, how do we, from the local filmmaker community in Ukraine is like, how does someone outside of Ukraine see our product? So often these licensing deals are made through film markets. Like obviously the big ones are like Cannes,
Berlin for TV.
Yeah, exactly. And often it's sort of a confluence of like, the buyers, the producers, the filmmakers, sales companies that are often led by sales agents. And these are people who really just sort of specialize in basically shopping content to their relationships of buyers in different countries, right? So they they're the ones who really have the strong relationships and know who all the local and regional buyers are, as well as your distributors. I think it's really important to know that this is a lot of work, right? Like, it's really hard to know who's who on every level in the different countries, right? Especially when you're not talking to them every day. So that's why we sort of recommend, talking to, like, if you have a great piece of content that you think might work, talk to a sales agency, right? And see if they believe in the product, and let them be the ones to sort of help, broker the deals and broker sort of the relationships to sort of these international buyers.
And I might add, if I may just add also, with your financing partner often will be this entity, right? They'll have their own sales team in place. And to underline just this point, a lot of these, this is a full-time job. I mean, these are people who are going to these events, movie festivals, these TV markets. They're happening all around the year. And there are relationships that they have and they've been able to build over time. So often, that's what I'm saying. It's important to keep that in mind. Some producers do it themselves, but that's a lot of work. And it's good because once you start doing it, you start to have those relationships, and then you can kind of bring them new projects and that sort of thing. But it is something. So this is either done, as Josh said, through a sales agent or through this the finance partner who has been making money doing this, right? Because they recognize, as I said earlier, the acquisitions is where they make the profit. So they have a sales team in place. All of this is sort of worked out when you're doing your original financing.
Right. So we talked about the international streamers, which, are the big boys like Netflix and Disney Plus and Prime and Apple. And then, as Adam talked about a little earlier, there's the regional broadcasters. Some of the, bigger ones are NRK, ETV, ZDF, BBC, etc. So traditionally, as Adam had talked about, licensing is done after the completion of the project, but occasionally it can be done during production. So like if someone catches wind of something that's in production and sees the footage and is like, oh my goodness, like we love it, we have to have it now. Sometimes they'll come in early or like right after you've wrapped content. So that way they can get in early without it being competitive on their end. And licensing will often continue many years after, especially we refer to it as the long tail for revenue, which is often like content that is produced outside these companies. They'll typically want to do is sort of take this content that doesn't have necessarily immediately high demand, but are looking to sort of build out additional subscribers, right? So like as these companies are moving into new regions, new territories, by acquiring content outside of their own region, they're then sort of becoming more attractive to audiences elsewhere, and thus increasing their revenue.
Yeah, and also, I mean, like traditionally, right? Like this is maybe less true these days, but these famous purchasing wars, right? So you'll have a film or something at competition at a festival. You have all these distributors all coming in, all bidding for it, and then you get a lot of money. I mean, that was sort of the way it was for a long time. People would go to Sundance, they go to Toronto, all of these big international film festivals, and get content. TV can be the same way. So again, acquisitions. This is really where the money is made, and like I said, there are companies all around that are set up for this, that you need to be thinking about, looking and researching, finding out who you would work with to do that. So finally, what we'll do is I want to talk about this idea now of selecting your concept. And if anyone, I mean, most people we're talking with here are familiar with Pitch UA, certainly. As we suggest with Pitch UA, you've got to look at what your ideas are. I think we mentioned like some of the cultural funds have certain themes, have certain ideas that they want you to talk about, just like Pitch UA. You've got to really think about your idea. You may have your idea first, and then you have to think, does it align? Does it make sense? And Or maybe you have this other idea, or you have a couple of different ideas, and you're like, you know what, this idea aligns more with the themes and the ideas of what we're talking about. So choosing the idea is important, but we don't want you to sort of try to, whatever, Frankenstein this thing, right? You don't want to have to like cram certain themes or ideas into it in order to meet that criteria, because that never works, right? It's not how good things are made. So it is really about you having an idea that is authentic, that is organic, that you come up with, but is something that actually, will align with these points. So with that said, obviously the invasion of last February has changed everything in Ukraine, and along with that, right, it means that the world is paying attention to Ukraine in a way it never has before, right? They really are, in a way, the world really is seeing Ukraine for the first time. And so for that reason, we need to be telling stories that resonate both with the domestic audience, but also keep in mind the international audience. So for example, one of the projects we'll be showcasing next week that is being produced by Film UA, so a producer from Film UA will talk about it. That project, it deals with the early days of the war since the invasion. And so for a domestic audience, that's very familiar, right? Like you all lived through this, but for an international audience, this is really new. We don't know what it was like. We don't know what it was like to be a Ukrainian citizen living in the country at the time. So these are things that you have to really balance. You've got to make it, entertaining, interesting for your domestic audience, but you've got to keep this eye to this international side. So the key to this is finding these authentic stories. We want, and I say this all the time, Ukraine has been making content, has had a very sophisticated industry for many, many years. It's obviously, and this is something that I personally am sort of very involved in, is sort of how do you maintain and maintain the industry, right? Because this is such an important industry for the world. But you want to showcase the unique qualities of Ukrainian culture, the characters, the personalities, the warmth, the humor, the strength, the conviction. And even if you're telling stories, that are historical or stories about either different parts or kind of relate to different parts of the world, you've got to keep in mind that we're seeing Ukraine in a new way. So there's this transformation piece to it. Even content that we were developing, I was developing content in 2021 that basically doesn't work anymore because it's not speaking to the Ukraine of 2023, right? This is a new world. So all of that has to be kept in mind. So it is, if you have an idea that has, and I'm working on a couple of projects right now where they were developed before, we've had to have this conversation. How do you talk about the transformation? How do you include the invasion? How do you do that? And like for comedies, that's really hard, right? Like this is a harsh reality of what Ukrainians are going through, but we're still making comedies. So, you've got to figure out how that works. And that transformation piece is really important, both in terms of just staying authentic, staying to the reality of what's happening in the world, but also, quite frankly, from the international perspective, people are very interested in what's happening in Ukraine as a result of this invasion. And shows like Mama, which is one of the teams that we did, and it was a project that Pitch UA helped produce in the last few years. That dealt with the war because it dealt with what was going on in the Donbass. And that has a whole new light now because you've got a much more sort of widely understood, war that is going on. So some of these older projects still make sense, but you've got to be thinking about what the audience, particularly the international audience, is seeing and perceiving about Ukraine.
Yeah, and I want to just add also with Mama, part of the, as Adam was saying, it's got to appeal to both the domestic and the international. And with the success of Mama, it was obviously built around an issue that took place domestically that is probably mostly familiarized by Ukrainians, but what the producers did and the creative team did that appealed broadly was that at the core of the story was about a mom in search of her missing son, right?
Yeah.
And that in its most simplistic and basic form is something that every single person can sort of identify with and understand from a story standpoint. So that's where, and they were able to, they were able to have their content acquired internationally, and the reason for that was because of this sort of simplicity at the end of the day.
And accessibility, right? Like that's an idea. Like the mother looking for a son is something that any mother in any culture really understands, right?
Right. So that speaks to our first point. Look for ways to tell stories that feel familiar. And these are, again, at the end of the day, you want to tell the story can sort of take place in any world and in sort of any type of format, but at the core is you just want to make sure that the story concepts and elements feel very universal, feel very familiar to us. Genres. So, Adam, you and I have, we preach this to, over and over, both here and there. We even had a discussion that basically was a 40-minute discussion about what genres and making sure that you essentially identify what your project is, right? So your genre is your identity. And oftentimes, it's really important to make sure that whatever story you're telling, exactly what the identity is. Like, don't tell a romance story, but then do it as a sci-fi horror film, right? Like, that's just not going to cross over.
I think that's called Vanilla Sky.
Well, yes. Yeah. Thank you, Tom Cruise. So oftentimes the genres that tend to work, on a broader, more universal base, are like the sci-fis, the horrors, the thrillers, and the romance. And then, look at proven formats, look at, shows that are about food or dating or, these competitive contests, like The Voice, for instance, or, British, America's Talent. So, there's
the baking show, right?
There's also the DIY, which, is the do-it-yourself shows, which, would be like, home improvement shows. Right. We worked on there was a project 2 years ago that was basically about, going to local villages or cities and basically having X amount of money to sort of help improve the look of a show, look of a house, for a family in need. And that format can work anywhere. Right. Then there's, the housewives, as, Adam likes to talk about a lot, that is very popular throughout, every culture and country.
And just to underline the point, like, obviously, you all know these are very familiar formats. You're very well aware of them. But why we're mentioning it is that you still have to be thinking of these formats, right, when talking internationally. So if you're going to be doing a swap show, right, a housewife in Poland comes to, in Warsaw, comes to Kiev, and a housewife in Kiev goes to Warsaw. Like, but you've got to be thinking still of these formats when, but you've got to figure out what is the international angle here. So, we did a show on borscht a number of years ago, and it's a fantastic show. And I've been trying since then. It was obviously, it was just about Ukraine. And it was actually, in many ways, helped fuel the idea that borscht has now become the national dish, of Ukraine. And the idea that we were actually starting to develop was, how do we make that show international? Because at least regional, right? Because there's borscht in Poland, there's borscht in the Baltics, right? Everyone makes their own borscht, right? So we started thinking about, how can we make the show more international? So again, these are formats that they do exist. All countries have the same formats. You now have to think about, how do I make what's the international piece of that, right? Um, and from the general notion, right? It's these stories have to feel accessible, right? You have to be able to go, as we talked about with Mama, like the mother looking for her son. Like there's nothing more universal than that, right? Like that's so powerful. So it is about finding these plots, finding the characters that will appeal to this wider international audience. And one of the things I've been stressing a lot, right, is that like, look at what's been happening in Ukraine, right? There are stories after stories of people, surviving and thriving, at times in what is this, horrible situation. And that is those stories of inspiration. Those are the stories that, quite frankly, will work internationally. People are very interested in that. So there is a kind of, be thinking, I guess, in terms of how are these stories going to awaken and really get people internationally sort of connected to it. So it's local stories, right? Think about, what's happening really there, but then look at the regional reach. What about the story that will actually connect to larger, communities, right? And what Josh will go into, what are the crossovers?
Right. So, so as we talked about, because a lot of the sort of the culture funding is based on tests and points, things to consider when you're basically putting these projects together. So, as Adam talked about, like if there's a Polish director who, makes sense for a project, who might not even live in Poland, like as long as he has the passport, that might be an opportunity to do a co-production, with Poland. If you're doing a story, and the Mama team will talk about this next week. Actually, they're doing a co-production right now with Estonia, where they, basically use some Estonian actors and those actors came to Ukraine, but there are parts of the project where the actors are speaking in Estonian. So those are things to think about, right? And we talked about like subject matters when you're thinking of concepts like historical figures. So like one of the obvious ideas is like if you did a story about Napoleon Bonaparte during his time in invasion into Ukraine, right? When they were taking on Russia. Joseph Conrad, who was obviously Ukrainian born, who eventually moved to the UK. Think about that, because there's a lot of crossover that can ultimately, bring together two entities. So stories that include locations, historic events of the partner countries, which we sort of just talked about, and creative and technical elements, and industries and professions, shared history, similar social issues. So again, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I mean, I've been obviously reading and writing a lot about Ukraine in the last 5 years. There's a historian teaching at Yale right now named Timothy Schneider, and he talks about Ukraine having all of the central themes of Europe over the last 1,000 years. Like everything that happened to Europe, all of the things, all the history of Europe, Ukraine has been experiencing and going through. This goes back to the Dark Ages and the Middle Ages, when you had these invading different, cultures that were coming in, the Mongolians, the Vikings. You have all of this history, all of this culture, all the way up to World War II, the Holocaust. These are all these sort of historical events that impacted Europe, all happened in Ukraine. So it really is. I mean, it's actually, like I said, part of this awakening of the world of how vital and critical Ukraine has been in the world. And these are the subjects that we have to be sort of focused on. And I think I would, sort of underline the idea that everyone that you're going to be talking to is aware of the war, is understanding the war. So it's about, this is really a moment of like, okay, so what about these partner companies or these partner countries culturally do you share? Western Ukraine has a lot of connection, was part of, Poland at one point, right? Was part of lots of different, part of Hungary, right? So you have all these sort of regional countries that you have shared history. So it's really looking at that. I mean, Ukraine has always been very diverse. So you want to be looking at those aspects of it when looking for these, what we call these crossover elements. You good? I think the last one. So then this is just to wrap up. What are your key elements, right? What do you need when you're going into these either, and this is mostly for co-production, but acquisition to a degree as well. Just what we do for pitch UA, you've got to walk in with a pitch, the short elevator pitch that basically has a visual element, a presentation, a video. Now, in Europe, right, they do all these sort of like pitch contests where you go in front of an audience and you pitch and you have a visual element. That's one aspect of the pitch. The other aspect is what we call the pitch deck. This is a deck that really gives you, it's almost sort of like a mixture between a Bible and a mood board, right? Like it's somewhere between, you have to talk about the central concept of your project, the characters, the world, the plot, right? The main arcs of the story, but also visually, this is how you're selling the project. So it's all about the mood and feel of the show. The tone of the show should all be in the imagery, right? So if it's very romantic, right, you're going to pick certain images. If it's more of a horror thing, obviously, right? So this is very critical, and it is like the expected piece now. You have to have a pitch deck. It can't just be the verbal pitch anymore. This is not something you actually talk about. This is something you give to them either ahead of time, before you meet, or after. It's the leave behind, what we call the leave behind. So this is an absolute you must have. If possible, get your pilot script. I can't tell you how important it is. People want to read. They want to see what you're doing. This opens sort of the door to seeing what the show will be. And ideally, a sizzle reel. Now, this can be made by pulling other footage of other shows and making it look like this is the quality or the sense of your show. Or if you're lucky enough to get a grant from the Pitch UA, you can make a trailer or a sizzle and shoot with actors and do that. In fact, that almost is better than doing a pilot, right? Because pilots often can't be reproduced. You have to reshoot them anyway when you do the whole series. So it's actually better to use those resources to make a short video that you can make really well. And if you have the capacity of doing that, it's incredible because it's the proof of concept. But they need to they do a pilot presentation. They basically set up visually what's happening. Again, this can be done just by stealing footage, right? Because none of this is meant for public consumption. It's only private. It's only meant for sales purposes. So you don't have any copyright requirements. But you do need a visual. Everyone's looking for video, and it's really important. And then finally, you have to have a budget. Budget out what the show is, at least primarily the below the line costs, right? Those have to be very hard. This is obviously determined where you're shooting it. It's showing knowledge. It's showing your expertise. We ask for a budget for Pitch UA. All of these funds are looking at budgets. And I'll tell you, a huge amount of the decision, I mean, they may like your concept. They may think your idea is great, but we'll look at your budget. And if your budget looks like you know what you're doing, this is really the proof. If you have a serious budget that is real, that will help you. If your budget isn't real, we will know. And so people, looking at this, do look at the budget. It is very important to have it. It shows you're professional. It shows that you're really ready to go and make the show. All right. Well, that is our basic, like I said, our primer of it. And I think
I have
ready
questions.
For questions. Yeah.
I have questions. Thank you very much for all these great insights. So I wanted to ask you, now that there's so much content being produced in Ukraine, and so many content producers are trying to get their work seen outside of Ukraine, or get it produced with help from partners who are outside of Ukraine. How much of the work connection do you think should be in that content to get the international partners interested? Like does that content need to relate directly to what's happening in Ukraine right now because of the war, or would these content producers have more chances to have a successful pitch if their content is about Ukraine but is not directly related to the war, because the sentiment that these international partners might have is that, well, we have a lot of this war stuff on the news, so we would rather look at something that's not about the war per se.
Well, I'll answer honestly. I don't know. We are testing this right now with projects. The idea would be that we have, obviously, what I would just say is this: you can't avoid the war, right? It's what everyone's talking about. It's what everyone is seeing. So even if your project doesn't directly deal with the war, you need to in some way understand how people are perceiving Ukraine as a result of it. So it's, I wouldn't say it's paramount, because you're, and again, this goes back to the domestic audience versus the international audience. A colleague of mine, a Ukrainian producer, was saying, there are these movies that are coming out about the war or about, snipers or, these types of stories where they're not doing very well in Ukraine, because I don't think Ukrainians want to see this anymore, right? Like, the Ukrainians are looking to be relieved of this, right? They want to have a comedy. They want something else. So there is this important need to create content for the Ukrainian audience that they want to see. That said, you have to somehow think about how the war has changed Ukraine, and how people, and it's just going to be part of the conversation. So content that existed 2 or 3 years ago, it just doesn't, Ukraine is really, I think, certainly to the world, and often to what I've heard and what I've listened to with the Ukrainians, to themselves, have changed. So you've got to, I should say, it's got to reflect that. It's got to reflect that change to a certain degree, because it's just going to be the topic of conversation. There are historical shows that we're working with that we're taking out. But like I said, even when we're talking about that, we're finding themes or ideas that resonate as a result of what's happened over the last year. So it is something that you still keep in mind.
Right.
I don't know if Josh.
Yeah, I mean, I would just, obviously, Adam, you're a lot more boots on the ground with some of the international buyers with Ukrainian content, but just big picture and obviously having some experience in the space. Again, it just boils down to storytelling, right? So like at the end of the day, it's like, what is your story really about? And that then can sort of be tied in either directly or indirectly to, what's currently happening in Ukraine, whether that's about the war or sort of about the impact of how things have shifted as a result of the war, right? But at the end of the day, it's really figuring out what is the story you want to tell. And then from there, figure out how you want to build that out and what elements do you ultimately want to incorporate. Because one thing to think about is, history and things change very quickly, right? So like you might want to do something specifically war related that happened last month, and 6 months from now, by the time, you get some interest and get some traction, that might not be relevant anymore. So those are things to ultimately think about. And that's why, stressing, figure out what your story is first and figure out how ultimately your characters can sort of navigate in that sort of sandbox.
So interestingly, one single piece of content that was produced in Ukraine that has gained tremendous international popularity and demand is this animated feature, Mavka, that was conceived a long time before the war, that was in production before the full-scale invasion, and that was finished already during during Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. and the United States Agency for International Development, through our project, TCA, helped fund the post-production of this tremendous animated feature. And now it has been sold to some 80 countries. And of course, it is not at all related to the war in Ukraine, but just because there is so much interest to content coming out of Ukraine and to the Ukrainian culture, the stars just came together in such a way that this content gained so much interest from all sorts of territories that never even showed any Ukrainian content before.
Yeah, and this, and I was just going to say, oh, go ahead.
No, I Alex, to your point, and Mavka is very well produced. It looks great, and the story is very simple. I think it sort of goes back to what we were sort of saying early on is, right now there's a really great opportunity as Ukrainian content makers to sort of get your stuff seen because people are paying attention to Ukraine, right? There's a genuine interest from the international community to sort of pay attention. And as you said, even though Mavka has nothing to do with the war itself, I think the fact that it's Ukrainian and well produced, it's opening up doors that maybe before weren't there.
Yeah, and I would even add, like in the first few weeks after the invasion, Netflix started showing Servant of the People, right? Because now you have your president is becoming the new Winston Churchill, right? This historical figure. And Servant of the People is a show that obviously you all know and was very popular there, but the world hadn't seen. So now there was interest in it. That said, it's this complicated problem that I am constantly butting my head against, which is there is interest by an audience in Ukraine. The problem that I'm facing is that the decision makers who are at these companies are resistant to it. They don't know, it's not been tested. So, they're going to go for what they know works. And that's the battle we have. So for example, one of the reasons why we're talking to NRK next week is the regional broadcasters are much more willing to jump on. They've been much more willing to do this. Film is a little bit different. I mean, film is an international medium anyway, and that distribution works, is sort of more tested. So for a film like for a film, it's a different kind of process. But the regional broadcasters should be our primary focus. And in fact, that's why we're talking to them next week with the future Pitch UA projects. That's really what we're going to be talking to. The hope is that more of these projects come out, they do well, and then you've got these international streamers who suddenly say, okay, this did well, we want our Ukrainian projects now. So they're more open to it. So we need to start to having some successes to show that this is a viable, that these shows are viable and will find an audience internationally.
From your personal perspective, what stories from Ukraine do you think are still missing? What angles, maybe like something even around the war, something that has not been told, and you feel like there is something that needs to be told, but nobody takes on these subjects?
Josh, you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to. I mean, that's obviously a very general question, and some things will stick, some things won't stick, as Adam was sort of alluding to earlier. But look, I think right now, there's a lot of human stories that are very interesting that's coming out of Ukraine that need to be told. Again, the Osnova production team is currently in post on a project that I actually believe has a lot of international appeal to it, because it's about sort of inspired by true events of a young boy who was sent away by his mother to basically flee to Estonia, right? So it's the story of a refugee that obviously applies to thousands of people, in Ukraine. And again, these are very basic stories that people can sort of relate to on a thematic level. And then there could be, there could be more direct war-related events that the international media has taken a liking to. Like, we talked about, Adam and I had talked about this a few times, like early last year, the whole Snake Island event, which was really captured by the entire international media community. I mean, it was everywhere here, like in the newspaper publications, on television. Maybe there's a story to talk about, like sort of like a Black Hawk Down story about the actual participants who survived and fought very bravely and courageously during that period. So it's looking at sort of underdog stories. I think international audiences tend to love underdog stories. And I think one of the things that's really important right now is people want to be inspired, right? Like we're coming out of COVID. Obviously, the war is happening. Every day we turn on the television, bad stuff is happening. We look on Twitter, bad stuff is happening. So, part of our responsibility as content makers is to entertain audiences, right? So I would look at stories that actually feel like they can entertain and sort of inspire, versus like something that's like, all right, this is a really depressing story, but I want to tell it. But to be honest, there's no differentiation than me turning on the television. I just don't think that's what audiences want right now.
I completely agree with what you're saying, Josh. I think that in stories of inspiration, I want to see more of. I want to the story of, and there are so many things that have happened in this war that's changing Ukraine. Women have played such an important role here in a way that I don't think has happened in any other country in the time of war. The story of Tara, the medic, who is continuing to help people. I mean, that story itself is just remarkable, and kind of it's like the Snake Island. These things got picked up by the international media, so it's just start looking at those, right? Stories of inspiration, and from a bigger point of view, because this is true. We've been talking, even on a smaller level when we're dealing with like social media or whatever. Stories that do well internationally are the same stories that are kind of the same thematic stories that do well socially, like on social media, that are palatable, they're social, they're inspirational, they're I know because we're doing something on this. Patron, the dog Patron, was one of those stories that, in the midst of all this horror and terror that is going on, you have this story of a dog that's a bomb-sniffing dog that, like, suddenly everyone all over, Instagram or wherever it was just fell in love with this dog and the story. And so it is about finding stories that kind of look at the war or look at what's happening in Ukraine, but really showcasing what I've seen in the Ukrainian sort of culture and of the people, this kind of warmth, this irony, all of those characteristics that are unique to Ukraine, that are so different from other parts of Eastern Europe, right? Like Ukraine really has that. So I really just think it's about finding, there's a whole bunch of historical things that have been happening, and this is about documenting history. So I would say looking at that, but looking at stories of inspiration, there is no bigger, the underdog of the century is Ukraine. Okay, so this is all about, that's why Americans have been very supportive of it, and is that they love an underdog story, and the fact that no one thought Ukraine would last 5 days or 3 days, And now we're going into the next year of this war, the next year since the invasion, I should say, the full-scale war. This is something that everyone's looking at. So we're wanting to see these kinds of stories.
Do you think Ukrainian creatives might have any luck pitching stories that are not at all related to Ukraine? Stories that are not just universal, but even take place in somewhere that's not Ukraine? Or would there be an expectation that, well, okay, you're coming from Ukraine, so you should be telling something about Ukraine, and if you're telling something that's not about Ukraine, then maybe you don't even know much about it. We have others who know a lot more, or we're used to working with them, so why don't you just stick to your theme?
Well, it's funny because I'm seeing kind of a reverse thing. I see a lot of filmmakers and people wanting to make stories about Ukraine who are from other countries. So you're getting that sort of opposite effect. So I don't think there's any problem with producers in Ukraine and creatives in Ukraine making stories in other countries and about other topics. You just have to know what story you're telling, right? Like, this is just, I think, look, it's the project, right? If it's going to work, if it's going to, get attention, that's it. It's the idea and the content. I don't think it matters per se if it's about Ukraine or not Ukraine. Obviously, the Ukrainian story is so big. It has its advantages, right? In that regard, it is catching this moment in history. So that's kind of where I would sort of say, yeah, that would make more sense. But going back to Josh's point, it's not just about telling the exact what we're already seeing on CNN, right? You need to tell stories that go beyond that tell the story that we could never have seen. And that's, I think, the more important piece there. It's not so much about your nationality per se. I think it is about, like any good story, it's telling something, showing us something that we've never seen before.
Right. Yeah, and Alex, I would just sort of add on to the idea that, if you're going to tell a story that takes place outside of Ukraine, again, I agree with what Adam said, but you just have to be prepared why you're telling that story and why you, as the representative of the storyteller, will be an expert basically in telling that story. So you're going to have to just be very prepared and have very specific answers why you think you should be the one telling the story. And, I would also say, for some of the more experienced, producers or, filmmakers, whether director or screenwriter, as your brand grows and as you become a little bit more well-known internationally outside of Ukraine, like that also will help open up doors beyond borders, and you might have a really talented Ukrainian filmmaker who wants to do a story about something that takes place in Italy. And because of just their CV and because of their experience, that too will be very helpful as well. So.
We have this question in the chat here that's basically about finding these international partners. Like, where do you start looking for them? Where do you even find them? And you listed some of the potential partners, like the big names, BBC, CDF, Netflix, even NRK. But if you approach those, like, how do you approach them? Who do you contact? Do you just send your pitch to a general email? Do you need to find a particular person? What if you can't find that person? How do you get into the door with your pitch into these bigger organizations? And the same with the smaller ones. Like, how do you get them interested, and who do you contact?
I'll take that. It's always better, and where you have to start is you have to look for production companies first. You've got to find production companies in these countries, and then go to the broadcaster, or then go to the streamer. And the way to find out is look at the shows that are being produced, right? Look at what companies are involved. There's a show, one of the shows that we're talking about next week is being produced by Red Arrow, which is a German company. And so it's really about finding those companies first. And all of those companies have people at these markets, at these festivals. So what producers have to start doing is they have to go to the festivals and they network. You've got to find these production companies that are actually making this content, that are interested in doing this because they've had success. And you do it by literally looking at who's co-financing these projects. And it's all on the internet. And reaching out to those companies directly. I just don't advise trying to go, like, Netflix will not look at projects. They will not look at original projects. That's just the fact right now. So you need to go develop the projects for regional companies. And even NRK is going to be here. They're great and they're very open to these projects. But quite frankly, it will be better if you can find companies that have already worked with them. I mean, that's always kind of the rule of thumb, right? Josh would agree. Like, all of these broadcasters and distributors and streamers, they have companies that they have worked with in the past. Endemol, there's a whole bunch, right? But they all are big production studios that they've all worked with, and they will much prefer to work with them because they can guarantee their work. It's not as much of a risk. It's harder for these companies to come on a project where they don't really know you. So it is about finding those companies first, and then later, they'll guide the process at that point, and that's kind of what they'll do. So it is about finding those kind of initial relationships first.
Yep. I can't even add anything to it, Adam, because I think you summed it up really well. But I definitely discourage any blind submissions directly to these bigger companies, because again, chances are they won't even open up the email. So the best thing to do is explore pre-existing relationships on a regional level with some of these smaller, more local based production companies that already have relationships with the executives and with the companies themselves.
And one thing we didn't really talk about, or we kind of went through it quickly, but some cases you'll talk to a company like NRK about a potential co-production. And they're like, you know what, we like this project, but we don't have the room for it right now. We don't have the financing, whatever, but we're interested. So keep us, and they'll say, please tell us how it develops. And what that really is saying is they're open to an acquisition. And what you may find is if you've got all your co-production together, but you have a gap in your financing, you can sometimes go and pre-sell an acquisition to make up that gap. So that's how sometimes the co-production can turn into an acquisition, but they kind of work together. So, and that's all, again, it's all of these markets. C21 is the big international news of the international film and TV industry. They host these content events. London, there's a big one coming up in Budapest in June. They often have pitch contests involved, and these are big markets where you're going to meet people. So if you're you're looking at sort of trying to build relationships, you go and you network, right? It's the basic rules of any producer, right? You've got to go and meet people. That's how you do it.
I'm going to ask if anyone on Zoom wants to ask any questions. Чи хтось з тих, хто зараз з нами в Zoom хоче поставити?
What about any people who are in Zoom? Would you like to pose your questions for Adam and Josh? You can do it with your voice, turning on your mic and camera, please. Let us know if anybody has any of the remarks or questions which you'd like and you didn't still hear the answer?
Item, Josh, while people are thinking up there, if they still have any questions left, could you please give us a sneak preview of what's coming up on Monday and next Friday so people get a better idea what to expect? And I would love everyone to invite their colleagues to join us for those two events. So could you please just give a little more detail of what's going to happen there?
Sure. Well, on Monday, we're going to have two production teams. One is a Film UA team. They are, I think, today starting production on a show about the reason why people stayed in Ukraine after the invasion. It's an anthology show. It's very well written. They've got great talent attached. We're going to be meeting with Anna Elisiva, who is the producer for Film UA, and she'll tell you sort of like that story of how she, I think Estonia, ETV is involved, NRK is involved, the Brussels, the Belgium company is involved. I think there was interest in, I don't know where it ended up with Germany and France. So they went around, and granted, Film UA is set up for this, right? So that they have the capacity. They have one, I know I work a lot with them, so they have a lot of folks who are just, dedicated to going to these festivals, making these connections. So we'll talk about them, but we'll also get a sense a little bit about how Film UA has sort of kept fighting and surviving during this really difficult time. So we'll look at that. And then Josh, why don't you introduce the other team?
Yeah, so they're a production duo from Osnova Films, Tetiana Cooks and Victoria Gornstein. And this is their actual first co-production, as I mentioned, with Estonia that they are currently in post-production on feature film. And they've also had experience in selling their material to international buyers and companies. So really our intent is not so much to hear from our side, but to hear from actual Ukrainian producers who are doing it themselves. And so there'll be plenty of opportunities to be able to ask them questions as well directly.
So that's Monday. And the way we're seeing that, those are the sellers. They're like you. They're producers. Obviously, one is with a studio, but look, since the invasion, like even companies like Film UA have to be very resourceful. Like everyone is sort of like they're almost, having to operate independently. So that'll give you an idea about what that experience is. These are great case studies. And then on Friday, we're going to be meeting with the acquisition person and the co-production person at NRK. And they'll give you the perspective of kind of how they go through their process of both, meeting, finding, developing projects, and also the projects that they go and acquire, their thought process. And rather than just from our point of view, and obviously we give a very general idea, but they're going to talk very specifically why Norway is interested in this. What are the themes? What are the ideas? What are, what has been their experience? And in a sense, their stories is unique to them, but it's similar to Estonia or Germany or, any other country in Europe primarily, but even beyond Europe, Canada, Australia. There is, all of these countries have co-production and acquisition companies that do this. They have channels. They're a lot of them have national channels, and so you can kind of derive from this conversation really what the mindset of those buyers. So it will be helpful in that discussion, so that when you're having the conversation at a market, you understand kind of what their needs are, and it's important to know that because they've got to do their job, and you've got to got to appreciate what they need in order to best position your series or film.
Excellent. So we're looking forward to these two meetings on Monday and on Friday at 3 o'clock Kiev time. Всі, хто нас дивиться в Ютубі, хочу вас попросити.
Whoever is watching us in YouTube, please fill in the Google form and leave your contacts there for us to be able to directly connect with you and to send you info not only about the events of the educational platform Pitch UA, but also about the grant competition Pitch UA itself. So the last opportunity, the last minute call to say a couple of words and to express the wish and to pose a question for Adam and Josh. So far I can see that there's no one who would like to. Then we will finalize our today's meeting. I'd like to express my gratitude to anyone who has joined it. Please join us as well on Monday and next Friday. And okay, there is a question here. A question in the chat, and it's in Ukrainian, so I will try to translate it then.
Adam, Josh, we have one question here, which is about selecting stories for the Western viewer. For instance, the story about the Snake Island, which you mentioned, it was bright, but it's now all over, and it's sort of in the past. Over the year of war, so many other little episodes have taken place, and they were even more dramatic than that one, and there were more victims, and there were more interesting heroes. But it looks like the West's attention is so fragmented that they only want to hear about one thing, and that's how they see our war. Do you think that's true?
Well, I'll answer it quick because I have to jump off. No, I don't think that's true. I think it just sort of boils into like what's like, for instance, like with Snake Island, if you were to do a story about it, even though it took place a year ago, again, it's a really well-known story around the international communities, right? So as soon as you say Snake Island, you immediately understand what that story was, but then it's up to you as the storyteller to sort of figure out what sort of what's the angle in, right? And that's sort of told through your characters and sort of your point of view of how you want to tell that event. The Snake Island example was just sort of like, all right, here's a big event that people are familiar with, right? So just because something happened a year ago doesn't mean there's no interest in it. In fact, I actually would argue that could be one of the, truly like big international sort of storytelling events that happen around the war that could be a really fascinating story to tell. And if you look at sort of the history of, especially in the U.S. markets, like a lot of times war will happen, and then all of a sudden, like 5-10 years later, like all of a sudden you'll start having this influx of stories about Vietnam or World War II or the Afghanistan war that happened in the 90s. So it's really just about how you want to tell your story and how you want to tell your characters. And I would look at it less, if there's an event that, that took place 2 years ago that isn't quite well known, you might have a harder time sort of selling your partners to get behind it. But I don't think something like Snake Island, just because it happened a year ago, is no longer relevant. And I think what we're trying to sort of stress is that if you do want to pursue these sort of international markets, look at events that happen on an international level that people inherently understand without having to explain for 5 minutes like what happened there. But it's then your job to sort of figure out what's the sort of the contemporary story into that. So like, again, even though a lot has changed, your themes about a story with Snake Island, which, is again, a very much of an underdog story and is very much about heroics and sort of bravery. Those are universal themes that will feel very contemporary today.
Yeah, let's not forget that All Quiet on the Western Front just won
Exactly.
Academy Award.
Exactly.
So it's about
And I think it's
a war that took place more than 100 years ago.
It might be hard for all Ukrainians to recognize it from within the country, and it's so personal and so real to you. But all of these events, this is history happening, and all of these different things that have happened. I mean, remember the famous story of the Kiev pilot, right? Which was, we don't know if it was real or not, but it was just, there are so many of these events and stories that have happened, all of which, again, if it's a good story, it's going to work. And quite frankly, there's so much here. There's so many amazing stories that are happening. So really look at that. It doesn't matter if it was a year ago or not. It's all still really quite interesting. So it's not about there's no sort of shelf life on this stuff. This is really a monumental world history event. And there are going to be stories and told about this war for decades and decades and decades. So it's all relevant.
All right.
All right.
Josh, thank you.
We should get going. All right. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you Monday, same time.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing you next week, Monday and Friday. І так само ми очікуємо всіх, хто приєднався до нас сьогодні.
And we're also waiting for everybody who has joined us today. Please take your colleagues with you. Send them our invitations on Monday at 3 p.m. and Friday, 3 p.m. Kyiv time. We are waiting for you. The audio and video recording of our today's discussion will be also posted, as well as the next two, the following two, will be at our YouTube channel. So the ones who failed to join us today will be able to see it later. So thank you, everyone. We thank our interpreters and everybody who has technically supported us and made this broadcast possible. And we wish you a peaceful day and evening, and see you next week. Goodbye.